Well, I think we might kick off. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Trinity, and especially welcome to the Trinity Long Room Hub. This is our Humanities Institute. It was built precisely for occasions like this, where we would meet and debate some of the critical issues facing Ireland at the time. I think the admission system is one such issue, and also, of course, to debate and exchange ideas about a whole range of issues relating to the humanities and humanities research. My name is Patrick Gagan. I'm the college's senior lecturer, which is the Dean of Undergraduate Studies, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all here this morning. You will notice that we are filming the recording. It will be put up on our Undergraduate Studies website in the next few days. So if anyone has an objection to being filmed, not speak now or forever hold your peace, but maybe during the commercial break let us know that you would like to be edited out of the final version. You may also notice that we have handed out forms where you are asked over the next couple of hours to come up with how you would admit this hypothetical 10 students on a course in an ideal world, because you will see from the programme that Dr. John Bowman, the great broadcaster, is chairing the afternoon sessions, and we are trying to revive the questions and answers format. That was such a great format. There was no problem about mischievous tweets, destabilising campaigns. There was no problem about controversy and all that, except in the other presidential election. But we are going to return to a more innocent time of broadcasting with Dr. Bowman, and so we will use that format to help facilitate the discussion in the afternoon. I'm going to introduce our first three speakers as they get up to speak, but first of all I'm delighted to introduce the new Secretary General of the Department of Education and Skills, Seán Foghlú, and he is probably uniquely placed to open this conference. He was, I think, the Secretary of the Points Commission and worked very closely with Professor Anya Hyland. He worked with the National Qualifications Framework Authority, and of course now he's the new Secretary General. And I think there could be no, and of course he is a Trinity graduate in early and modern Irish for his undergraduate and a master's. So an added reason why he is the perfect person to open our conference this morning, Undergraduate Admissions for the 21st Century.
Thanks a lot. A privilege to be here to open this conference this morning. It's great also to see such a full room. I think people were turned away. It's a very important issue, and I think the enthusiasm of everybody to want to come and debate the issues here today signals what an important issue it is today. Just want to express my thanks and those of the department to the Provost, Dr. Patrick Prendergast, and to the Senior Lecturer, Dr. Patrick Gagan, for inviting me and for hosting this conference. As Secretary General, clearly I appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak, and as Patrick has said, my background in this issue has been quite intense, particularly with the Commission on the Points System, and I worked on that for 2 years as Secretary with Professor Anya Hyland, who we'll hear from later on, but then moving on to the Chief Executive Officer job in the National Qualifications Authority of Ireland and establishing the National Framework of Qualifications with the support of all of the education and training institutions and the awarding bodies, and trying to improve and diversify the transfer and progression arrangements. And I think the point system is a key element in that. We've had a lot of work done in the last couple of years on the point system, and I think the attendance today of the Chair and the CEO of the Higher Education Authority, and the new chair of the NCCA, Bridget McManus, and the CEO of the NCCA, just demonstrates the high level commitment of those two organisations to the change process that they have led in terms of the conference that they hosted last September on transitions and pushing for change in that regard. This is not an easy issue. It's not an easy issue because it involves change in second level and it involves change in higher education. But maybe just to start, it might be helpful to place it in the context of the key transitions in the education and training system. Now, for ease, I might just set further education aside, but let's just think about the entry to primary school first and think about where we're going. We've just established a new preschool system, and effectively what we're trying to do now is to change the transition into primary education. We might not be aware of the detail of it here today, but effectively there's a great piece of work that the NCCA have been involved in in Astor, which is broadening and diversifying the curriculum in the first 2 years of primary education. I think that's very important. It's worth thinking about in terms of transition. In many ways, we're trying to make the first 2 years of primary school a bit less like primary school and a bit more like preschool, and valuing play more. I'm going to take this on, it might sound not sound very relevant. Move into the transition from primary to second level. What's the key change there? The key change there is that we're trying to change the junior cycle to enable people to move in from primary schooling into second level without the key transitional difficulties that have been identified in all of the research that the NCCA has taken on. We know it's a long-term change agenda to start changing the junior cycle, but we have a real plan to do it. We want to diversify, we want broader skills base, we want different types of learning, we want group learning, we want problem solving in different ways. It's a long-term change agenda. Now let's look at the next one. This is the one we're looking at. It's neither a change agenda just for higher education, nor just for second level education, nor just for the exam that happens at the end of second level education. It's a shared change agenda. The issues in the change agenda were identified, I would say, of course, very well by the Commission on the Point System 11 or 12 years ago now. And we knew what they were. We worked on some of them over the last 10 or 12 years. There has been even more transparency as the Points Commission called for. We've tried the graduate entry into medicine. There have been some changes, but some of the more fundamental changes, to be honest, we reflected on them and we weren't able to move and actually get them done because it involved real change from stakeholders in schooling and in higher education, where in reality they needed to look at it in a different way. I think we've looked at it in a different way now with the HEA Transitions Conference. We have a real change agenda for second level and for third level. For second level, the challenges aren't simple. I think there is an overall agreement. We need to continue to use the Leaving Certificate as the basis for decision making, but that doesn't mean that we don't change the Leaving Certificate. The Leaving Certificate curriculum itself is changing. We have a lot of new subjects coming on board. We have a lot of diverse skills in the curriculum. The key issue is probably now how we can move to having broader assessment. The group, the HEA and the NCCA, have two key findings in that regard, and they're two very important key findings. The first is the need really to test the predictability of the Leaving Certificate. This is probably the most difficult issue of all, and it's not one that we're jumping at, but it is one that we have to really consider. People are happy in general in society when they know the challenges that they're facing. They're less happy when it can't be as predictable. So the State Exams Commission is undertaking some research in that regard to see how predictable the Leaving Certificate really is, and to see what can be done in terms of advancing change in that regard. That would be a key issue, because we have a very interesting discussion in society, and I was going to say media, but I don't just mean the media, because it's actually widespread across society. People can be frustrated about aspects of the Leaving Certificate, but they're also frustrated when the Leaving Certificate isn't predictable, and that those two things don't add up. But that's the reality. That's the reality of the position. The other key element, I think, of the Leaving Certificate is to rethink a change that we all made about 20 years ago. We moved the Leaving Certificate about 20 years ago through a combined the combined work of the department and the higher education institutions to having a grading system, so that there's a grading system for every 5 percentage points. Well, I know that's not absolutely at the very bottom or the very top, but effectively nobody is ever any more than 2.5 percentage points from a different grade. Now that is very, very difficult to stand over. I'm not saying it's impossible, because we've been obviously doing it for 20 years, but it's a very, very difficult, because it requires an absolute precision of marking systems, and then we have really advanced the transparency about the rationale for the marking systems, the openness for people coming to look at the exams. But at the same time, it's something that I think we really do need to look at, and again it's been highlighted in the advice that we've got, that we need to review and rethink whether that's the right approach, and that's a key part which we'll be looking at once we've moved on from the predictability. Those are two sets of key changes which which we aren't jumping at, but which we are looking at in a very active way with a view to seeing can we address. Turning to higher education, and I think, as I said, we can't look at higher education without looking first at what second level education is doing. There's a real call in the advice of the NCCA and the HEA to refresh the learning objectives of undergraduate students. Now, that's very easily said, but it is actually quite a complex and difficult thing to do. We need to really reinforce the first year broad foundational experience, and that needs concentrated action across higher education institutions. I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about that, and I think there's been a lot of movement towards it, but we probably need to formalise it in a much more agreed way. But I think one of the biggest areas, and this was one of the biggest recommendations of the Commission on the Point System, and it's one where it's gone the other way in the last 10 years, is the diversification of programmes. We have a real issue where it is attractive for higher education institutions to have precise undergraduate programmes and precise numbers to enter undergraduate programmes. It's all higher education institutions do it in some areas. Not all of them do it in every faculty, and some do it in some faculties and not in others. So there's a balanced approach. It may seem to work well for the students who get in, and they may seem to have a very good learning experience, but it forces choice back into the second level system, and it forces competition back into the second level system. And that is a key area where the HEA and the NCCA have asked higher education institutions to reflect. And I think it's a key area where that reflection needs not just to be about the experience, the successful experience of those who have entered. It has to be having full regard to the impact back into the schooling system. Because again, the research shows this isn't just impact back into the senior cycle, this is impact back into the junior cycle, and sometimes people are even talking about impact back into primary education. So these are very important stages. I think the interrelationships between the issues and the need for the system at second level and higher education level to jump together shows how difficult it is. It's not possible really in the competitive market that there is for entry into higher education, and we can't forget it's a competitive market for individual institutions to jump together, to jump separately on these issues. It needs to be a collective decision, and there's a particular responsibility on the Institutes of Technology and the universities in particular collectively to come to agreements on ways forward to ensure that these key issues are addressed in a real way. That being said, it's absolutely brilliant that individual institutions such as Trinity are working through the issues, because higher education institutions are academically democratic to a certain extent. They need to work the issues through, they need to understand the impact, but all institutions need to do that in a way that understands their impact on the schooling system and doesn't just look at it in terms of the impact within higher education. That's the biggest change. It's really, really hard for us all to get our heads around. I can remember the arguments on the Commission on the Point System, or debates, because it wasn't heated, but it was contested, about the different impacts on different sectors and the lack of awareness and the things that even experts learned about the system. I can remember some things that Anya had learned that were happening in individual institutions or whatever around details of the system of entry that people wouldn't have. That there's just this system is just so detailed and so crafted, and we need to jump together so that we can ensure that real change happens, that it makes a real difference. So, as I said, I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to open this conference. I look forward to being here for part of it and to the open and active engagement of the department with the conference, and the outcomes of the conference feeding in to Trinity's own views, and from there to the IUA and into the work with the HEA and the NCCA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've been in my role as Senior Lecturer, Dean of Undergraduate Studies, since the 1st of September, And when I was given the job, the Provost asked me that in addition to my regular responsibilities, he wanted me to prioritise 3 areas. The first was how we admit our students, the second was how we teach our students, and the third was how we assess our students. And small challenge. But his vision has been the driving force behind this conference, and so I'm delighted to introduce the Provost of Trinity College, Dr. Patrick Prendergast.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to see so many people here for what is one of the most important conferences of my provostship to date. I particularly welcome Mr. Seán Foghlú to Trinity in his first official visit since his appointment as Secretary General in the Department of Education and Skills. Just over a year ago, when I was presenting myself as a candidate for the provostship, I set out my priorities, the key things I felt Trinity should do in order to continue to excel. And among these priorities was an unambiguous pledge to revisit the process of admitting students to the university. I promised, and I'm quoting now from my manifesto, to explore admissions criteria beyond a purely points-based mechanism and further develop Trinity's pioneering work in non-traditional access routes. Why, among all the important tasks of a university, did I focus on admissions? For 3 reasons. First, obviously because I'm not satisfied with the current admission system, this purely points-based mechanism. I look at the reasons for that dissatisfaction in a moment, but I'll just stress now that I don't regard the CAO points system as a bad system. Far from it. My problem with the points system is captured by that word purely. It's not a bad system, but it's bad that it's the only gateway to college. We need to provide other access routes for students whose potential is not captured by the Leaving Cert. The second reason I made admissions an election issue, if you like, was because I was aware, and I am aware, that admissions is not something that will ever change or improve by itself. There's a system in place, and no incremental change or improvement is built into that system. So unless we force change, in fact, nothing will happen. The 21st century is now well underway, and we've done nothing fundamental about university admissions for decades. So I knew that it was only by making it an issue and convening a conference such as this that something could really happen. And third, I was also aware, when thinking of my priorities, should I be elected Provost, that quite often times of crisis are times of change, for the reason that people are more inclined to take risks in times of crisis because they've invested less in the status quo. And Ireland is now in a crisis, there's no question about that. So let's do something positive with that crisis. So now, why the dissatisfaction with a purely points-based mechanism for undergraduate admissions? The system, to its great credit, is totally transparent, which is crucial in a small country where personal and family networks are so important. It was also technologically groundbreaking when it was introduced. Pioneered, in fact, or had a big input at the time, was my predecessor, Provost Watts. And the Central Applications Office is trusted and it's efficient. And every year we enroll excellent students. So what's the problem? Well, as an educator, I've identified 3 problems which do impact seriously on the type of education we seek to offer in Trinity. First, the right student isn't always matched to the right course. Now, I know this is a problem in universities across the world, but the nature of the points system means that the problem is exacerbated in Ireland. Courses get identified with points. So, for instance, because medicine is 600 plus points, then students gaining high points may feel their fit is medicine, even though they have greater aptitude for and love of, say, for the classics. Don't waste your points is a phrase often heard. Students, only 17 or 18-year-olds, remember, are subject to many pressures, including societal pressures valuing some kinds of knowledge over others. A 10-year analysis of Trinity engineering students as yet to be published, but we will publish this, reveals that a high overall points does not measure aptitude for the subject. Now just think about that. It's shown that students with a low overall CAO points, but with good achievements in certain subjects, do better than those with high points, but poor achievement in certain other subjects. We should take these findings very seriously. They point to the need for a much more nuanced entry system. Our studies have shown that inadequate course information is the single biggest reason why students drop out of college. This brings into play the whole issue of retention, which is, of course, aligned with admissions. There's little point in enrolling great students and then have them drop out because they're in the wrong course. In a time of limited resources, we need to ensure we match up students, courses and colleges as accurately as possible across the sector. Furthermore, if students stay to the bitter end of a course they're not suited to, that can't count as success either. A university acting in the public good will find a way to deal with these retention issues as effectively as possible. In this regard, the point system is a bit of a blunt instrument. It doesn't take into account significant individuality, nor does it allow for the fact that different universities seek different attributes from students. In Ireland, we have a dynamic third level sector with numerous institutions of higher education, each with its own mission, each offering its own distinctive type of education. In Trinity, for instance, we offer a research-based education focused toward a deep knowledge of the discipline, often interdisciplinary, which prioritises critical thinking, inquisitiveness and independence of mind. It's not primarily job-oriented, whereas other institutions pride themselves on offering an education oriented to qualifying students for the immediate requirements of the job market. Now, this diversity is good. It's to be applauded because different students have different needs. One size certainly doesn't fit all. Society needs diversity in its universities, and we would welcome admission paths that recognise this. This is a big issue for the conference, and before lunch we will examine the challenge of measuring potential, motivation and suitability for a course. One of our speakers, Georgina Smitik, just back from an Erasmus year in Strasbourg, sitting here in the front, and next year will be entering her final year in Trinity in French and Business. Starting out, Georgina picked the wrong course in the wrong college. Fortunately, she was able to change and is now thriving in Trinity. Inadequate course information was the key problem in her case, and her story is typical of many. Georgina decided to help other students avoid her mistake. She set up Course Hub at coursehub.ie, an online resource where students from around the country discuss their courses and their colleges on a completely independent site. We're proud of this initiative, not just because it was founded by a Trinity student, but because it serves a dual purpose. It helps prospective students make the decision that is right for them, and it helps us get a range of critical feedback, sometimes positive and sometimes negative, which we can listen to and learn from. The second major problem I've identified with our admission system is that when there's only one gateway, then one type of learning is unavoidably prioritized. The type of learning favored by the system. In this case, it's memory-based learning or rote learning. Now, I don't want to be pejorative here. Memory is, of course, crucial to intellect. But university students need other skills. So a lot of time is spent in the first year inspiring students with a new approach to learning. I want to emphasize this point here because I'm not against rote learning per se. Even in the internet age, there is still no substitute for carrying knowledge around in your head. But it's only one aspect of learning, and it shouldn't be given so much emphasis. Across college over the last month, we've been looking at how we assess our students. The schools have shared ideas and best practice, and what has emerged are new ideas about matching assessment methods to learning outcomes. Through diversifying assessment methods, we will meet our obligation to educate inquiring minds and active citizens. In Trinity, we have always prized extracurricular activities, and we do not see these as simply leisure activities. We encourage our students to get involved in clubs and societies, in volunteering and charity work, event organising, debating, and student politics. There's a whole range of ways students can develop outside the library, the laboratory, or the lecture theatre. Now, while we don't allow such activity to substitute for academic coursework as in some universities, we do show our commitment to such development by organising college life to give time for the extracurricular. And we also reward students for such activities through scholarships and awards. Recently, we recognised the volunteering activities of 450 students on the Dean of Students Roll of Honour. So, as an aside, a little bit of history maybe, Trinity is proud to have the oldest student undergraduate society in the world, the Philosophical Society, or the Phil, founded in 1683, and indeed the oldest documented football club, founded in 1854. Football, of course, meaning rugby. It's the only really kind of football there really is. What's fascinating to me is that these time-honoured methods of educating are also favoured by today's employers. A few months ago, David Broderick, who is in charge of graduate placement at IBEC, noted, "What employers are looking for is someone who stands out from the crowd, someone who demonstrates organisational ability through clubs and societies." And for those of you who read the Sunday Business Post, there was an article last Sunday by Eamon Sinnott, General Manager of Intel Ireland, and he was quoted as saying, "We need people with a capacity for critical thinking, problem solving, innovation and communication." What we have here is a coalescence between the type of education we want to offer and the type of education employers want, which is great. But if we want students gifted in critical thinking, problem solving, innovation, organisational ability, and so on, shouldn't we be casting the net wide while they're still in school? Yes, we can train them in such skills when they come here, but it's best for us and for them if they have a natural aptitude and wish to develop that way from the start. So when I say I want other gateways to college than the points system, I mean gateways that test for those kind of intelligences and aptitudes. This brings me now to my third and most fundamental problem with our purely points-based system. We are not only matching students to the wrong courses, we are not only having to inspire students away from rote learning towards critical thinking, but we are missing out on students who would have the ability to thrive here, academically and socially, but whose abilities are not being properly captured by a crude points total. These students are being failed by the system. In some cases, they're not getting a place on any third level course. This is a shocking waste of potential, and it's deeply unfair to the individual. My position on this is based on firm evidence. We know that the point system is failing students of potential and aptitude because in Trinity we do have a number of non-traditional access routes. For the past 2 decades, the Trinity Access Programs, or TAP, has been bringing students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds to college through alternate means. Students identified in their schools as having potential are interviewed and assessed for suitability by TAP. I know other universities such as UCD, DCU and UCC have related similar programs. I know how passionate and motivated these students are and how much potential they have. This year I taught a guest class on TAP, and the issue that we debated was how Ireland indeed, and Trinity in particular, should commemorate the 1916 Rising. We're in, as you know, the decade of commemorations. And their enthusiasm, energy and original thinking reaffirmed my belief that the point system fails some of our best students, and that higher education can and should be transformative for the life of each individual student. Recent studies were carried out in Trinity, DCU, UCC and UCD to assess the performance of non-traditional students. And guess what was found? It was found that these students in all universities, their results mirrored those attained by students that came in through the CAO point system. Statistically indistinguishable from them in some cases. with a majority of students attaining second-class honours or better who came in on access routes. When you consider that these students began with socio-economic disadvantage, such results are truly telling, and we can say with confidence that academic ability, as measured in Leaving Cert points, doesn't tell the whole story. Since the publication of the article that I wrote in the Irish Times on Tuesday, I've been struck by the incredible level of interest from teachers, parents, and especially students. And I think the number of people here at the conference today also reflects that. People who've got in touch with me by email or in person. One student's story in particular stood out. On Wednesday, I met a young man who would love to come to Trinity to study physics. He's a winner of prestigious national awards for his science projects. I won't say what awards because I think that identify him. As well as this, he has overcome incredible difficulties in his life. He has lost 2 brothers to drugs. One, the eldest, committed suicide. The second has just been sentenced to a term in prison. For this student, going to Trinity is not about pleasing his parents. It's about getting an education that will change his life and that of his family. He doesn't know if he's going to get the 500 points to study science or theoretical physics, given all that's gone on in his life this year. But it's a real tribute to his character that he's still determined to sit his leaving certificate in less than 3 weeks' time. We want students like that in Trinity. The fact that he has already been recognised nationally for his scientific achievements should surely count for something when we are admitting students, except that the current points-based system doesn't allow it. Many of these students who win these prestigious national awards in Ireland get a phone call from American or UK universities who can admit them. Yet we can't admit them here. We are able to take contextual information into account. If we were able to take contextual information into account and assess students on more than just their exam results, but what they achieved in life, what they have overcome, and why 450 points for some is more of an achievement than 600 points for others, then we would have a lot more students like him getting the educational opportunity they can benefit from, and our society would be a better place for it. So these are my 3 impacts of the current system. And today we want to continue the debate which the Minister for Education began when he took up office, to see if we can take some practical steps to resolve the identified problems. I've been talking about admissions in this country, but I should stress that this is a global problem. And we're honoured to be joined today by some leading international experts on admission. Professor Stephen Schwartz, who will deliver the keynote address after me, is Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University. His groundbreaking report for the UK government on fair admissions provides a roadmap for how we might proceed in Ireland. We share his belief that a fair admission system is one that provides equal opportunity for all individuals, regardless of background, to gain admission to a course suited to their ability and aspirations. We strongly endorse his view that preserving academic freedom requires that academic institutions retain 3 basic rights in relation to teaching: the right to choose who will teach, what will be taught, and to whom. Dr. Anna Zimdars of King's College London is on this morning's panel. She has done extensive work on undergraduate and graduate admissions to the University of Oxford, and we look forward to hearing how her research on higher education and social stratification and education in the UK might help us here in Ireland. We're delighted to be joined by the Provost of Oklahoma State University, Dr. Robert Sternberg. His groundbreaking book, College Admissions for the 21st Century, provides a radical way of thinking about how we admit our students and how we teach them. Sternberg's life's work has been to show the problems in relying on any single scale to admit students. He believes that we can do a much better job of college admissions, as well as instruction and assessment, if we think about student abilities in a broader way than we have, in particular by valuing, assessing, and teaching for analytical, creative, practical, and wisdom-based skills, as well as for memory-related ones. We in Trinity support this view, and believe there is much to learn from Professor Sternberg on how to identify those students with what he calls potential for future leadership and active citizenship. There is, of course, no one right answer to the admissions challenge. At different times, different people have offered different solutions, ranging from interviews to aptitude tests, personal statements and student profiling. I'm currently interested in exploring the use of digital technologies to record students' progress through second level, taking account of their learning outside the classroom, including volunteering, sporting and artistic and creative endeavours. This information could be maintained online and consulted by universities and institutions of higher education. The main thing is that we support the need to diversify enrolment. After lunch, one of our leading broadcasters, and I'm happy to say an honorary fellow of this college, Dr. John Bowman, will help us explore different admissions options. In the 2 afternoon panels, we will look at the theory of how we might admit students in an ideal world, and then the practicalities of how this might work using existing resources. We are delighted to welcome panelists from the CAO, the IUA, the IOTI, USI, the HEA and the NCCA, as well as members of our own internal working group on admissions on the curriculum, including Stephen McIntyre, formerly a senior director at Google and now head of Twitter's Europe, Middle East and Asia operations, based here in Dublin. It's important to have an external perspective and one representing the needs of employers. Finally, we are honoured to be joined by Professor Anya Hyland, one of the country's leading educationalists and someone whose pioneering report 9 months ago, provided a fresh impetus to this debate, by offering new ways of thinking about an old problem. So finally, the conference only forms part of the debate, and I hope there will be other opportunities in other venues to continue to look for solutions. But it's no good spending our time talking about the issues year on year unless we are prepared to act. How can we expect a new generation of students to be radical about facing the challenges of the world unless we are prepared to show them that we can be radical too? How can we demand a spirit of innovation at third level and beyond if we are not prepared to be innovative in how we assess and measure potential and a range of skills when we admit our students? Today we have set the challenge to admit 10 students on a hypothetical course if all other students are admitted in the usual way. And I can say that if a good idea emerges from this challenge, then we should be, and we in Trinity will be prepared to test it in real life by setting aside 10 places on a course such as law that normally demands very high points, and we'll see how it works in practice. A new generation demands that we do everything we can to rebuild our economy and our society. And I firmly believe that reforming university admissions is a great place to start. This new generation must be more globally competitive than ever. They deserve an education system that is prepared to recognise and reward creativity, leadership and independent thinking. I conclude by just saying I've never forgotten my own entrance into Trinity College. I came up from Wexford, staying out there with my aunt in Cabinteely, and she always reminds me when I meet her. And I came in and I actually didn't know where Trinity College was at all. I asked the man on the 45 bus where was Trinity College, and he pointed me to the railings, and that's how he recognised it. But entering in through Front Arch in 1983, I felt that sort of rush that I think every first-time Trinity student must feel as you go through the dark arch and out into the wide expanse of Front Square. This has always been for me a metaphor for what happens to the mind in Trinity. It opens out. Front Arch is our gateway, so let's get different minds and critical minds and innovative minds through this gateway and watch how they expand. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost. I'm wearing the tie of the HIST, the College Historical Society. I'm a vice president of the society, and it always hurts me when our great rival, the Phil, is mentioned and praised. The film may be older, but the hist can trace its roots back to Edmund Burke. But anyway, the Provost there mentioned our working group on admissions and the curriculum, and I'm delighted to see all the members of that working group there. We had the Students' Union Education Officer and members from across the 3 faculties, and Stephen McIntyre, an external representative. And we had great discussions, but I'll be honest and admit that by around Christmas time, we were kind of lost for direction about where we would go next. And it was at that point that we came across the Schwartz report, the report of the working group on fair admissions for the UK that was chaired by Professor Stephen Schwartz. And this offered us a roadmap for how we might proceed. And we were able to quote extensively from its recommendations. We even borrowed its formatting. And this report offered a roadmap for us. And when we were organising the conference, we realised that if Professor Schwartz was not able to join us, well then we would not go ahead with the conference. And we were delighted that he was able to accept our invitation, and indeed, despite suffering from jet lag, get up very early this morning to appear on Morning Ireland with Georgie Smithick. So we're delighted he is able to join us. He is the Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University. He has a very distinguished and extensive academic career, I think a New Yorker by birth, but has been an Australian for the past 30 years. And we're delighted to call on the Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University, Professor Stephen Schwartz.
Thanks very much. I've had quite a large number of academic jobs in my career, but one of them was Dean of Medicine. And I learned how unhealthy it is for you to sit there for this long a time. So I want everybody out. Thank you very much, and thank you, Patrick and Provost, for inviting me here today. My wife and I, who's joined me today, are both very grateful for the opportunity. But I have a confession to make to you. I am a wee bit nervous here this morning, and I'll tell you why. Just last week, I gave a talk to a professional audience just like this one. And I thought it went very well, especially when afterwards, a member of the audience came up to me and said, "I loved your talk. I think you should publish it." I sensed an opportunity to show off here, and I don't really pass up too many such opportunities. So I said to her, "Well, you know, I'm very busy. I've got a lot on my plate. Perhaps I'll publish it posthumously." "Oh, good," she said. "I can hardly wait." So I can imagine, you can imagine, why I'm just a little bit skittish here this way. Just in case I don't make it to the end of this talk, should I expire prematurely, I thought it might be safe to give you my 3 takeaway points right up front. Good, yes. I am not really planning. First is, for higher education and society as a whole, both of those will benefit if we are able to diversify our universities. The second point is, diversity is notoriously difficult to achieve. But, and that's my third takeaway point, it is actually possible to diversify if we want to. Now let me just get right started for the reasons I've said. Let's turn to that first point. Why should we care who gets into university? Why is it so important, not just for those of us involved in universities, but for society as a whole to care? And I thought that I might give you an example from my own background. Now, I can't hear it myself, but people tell me I speak with an American accent. And if I do, there's an explanation, and you've heard it. I was born and raised in the USA. And I came to Australia too long ago to remember, from Texas. many of you may know something about Texas, and it's usually something unusual, because Texas is one of those states that's quite known for unusual stories, and particularly unusual politicians. Previous President George W. Bush was a former Texas politician, but he's not the one I want to talk about. I want to tell you about another governor of Texas. His name was Ferguson, and Ferguson had the great misfortune to die in office. And in good old Texas style, he was replaced by his wife as governor. Her name was Margaret, but everybody in Texas knew her as Ma. And at the time that Ma Ferguson was governor of Texas, the state legislature was debating the thorny issue of how do you educate the children of Mexican migrants. Do you teach them in English, or do you teach them in their native language of Spanish, or some combination of the two? And this is one of those irresolvable questions. For all I know, it hasn't been answered yet. They may still be debating it in the legislature, but at the time, Ma Ferguson was certain that she knew the answer. She raised her hand and caught the speaker's eye, and she rose up to speak in Texas legislature, and she said, "Mr. Speaker, it's obvious to me that these children of Mexican migrants should be taught in English." And then she reached down and she picked up the Holy Bible, which sits in front of every member of the Texas State Legislature, and she pointed to it. And she said, "After all, Mr. Speaker, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, Now, the first thing you should know from that is it's obvious that Ma Ferguson was not the beneficiary of a Trinity College education. She was not entirely aware either of the great diversity of the human race. And when you think about it, that sort of ignorance and unworldliness can only come when you never actually meet anyone different from you. And I can give you an example from my own life. I grew up in a city in which about 45% of the inhabitants were Afro-American, that is, black. But I lived in a neighborhood that had no black people in it. I went to a school that had one black student in it. His father was the janitor. I swam in a swimming pool, a public swimming pool, that didn't have any black children swimming in it. I ate in restaurants and shopped in stores that had no black customers. For me, growing up, black people may as well have been invisible. We just never encountered any. And that brings out not just ignorance, but fear of the other as well. Things only started to change. They only started to change when the schools became integrated, and when black and white children started to work together, to learn together. And they learned about one another, which dissipated a lot of the fear of not knowing about people, but they also learned mutual respect. They learned to get along with each other. And as they grew up, they brought those values and experiences with them. And soon the town had a black mayor and a black commissioner of schools, even a black commissioner of police. And it's not possible today to live the kind of life that I live any longer in that town. And of course, Barack Obama is President of the United States. And the important thing about that story is all of that change occurred in my lifetime, in one lifetime. Miraculous, almost tumultuous, upside-down change, and it happened just as it did then, very rapidly, and it can still happen today. That diversity made the difference, and it can make the difference still. Diverse schooling is important for that reason. Now, one of the many benefits for attending Trinity College is that you actually do get to study not only with students from all over Ireland, but students from more than 100, I think it's 110 in the annual report, 110 different countries in the world. We'll be asking you to name 110 countries. What do they learn from one another? Well, they learn some obvious things. They learn to see the world through one another's eyes. They learn about different languages and different customs and different cuisines and different ways of dressing, different holidays. And all of those things are important and fun, but they're not the really important things that students learn from studying in a college like Trinity College. The most important things are tolerance and inclusivity and acceptance and fair play and communication. And those are the really vital lessons that you pick up when you study in a diverse institution. And I think many of you may, on reflection, agree that those lessons are just as important, if not more important, than the lessons that students learn in the classroom. In the words of Oliver Goldsmith, another Trinity College graduate, it's not from masters, but from their equals that youth learn knowledge of the world. Now, the United States Supreme Court actually quoted this in one of its decisions upholding a university's right to select students in order to create, specifically in order to create a diverse student body. They accepted Goldsmith's idea that there are lessons that can only be learned from other students, and that those lessons are facilitated, in fact made possible at all, by studying in a diverse university with students from many different backgrounds. So the number one reason why it's important for universities to diversify, and it's important to us to think about who gets into universities, the number one reason is it has very special educational value that students will not learn any other way, and therefore will have a more impoverished education. But there's another reason as well, and put simply, those students who attend university have better prospects in life than those students who don't. And this is particularly true of the students who get to study, the fortunate students that get to study in the most highly selective, prestigious universities, the ones that select their students from among many different applicants. I once wrote before, when I was working in England, that prestigious universities are life's gravy train. I didn't mean that in the negative way it sounded, or certainly the newspapers in England made it sound. But the graduates of the most selective universities get the best jobs. They go on to the best graduate programs. They make the most money. There is huge advantage in life to studying and graduating from a selective university. And remember, that kind of education is the traditional engine of social mobility. Poor but bright students who go to university get ahead and then contribute not only to their own betterment, but to the betterment of society as a whole. Unfortunately, one of the spin-offs of bad economic times is that social mobility is grinding to a halt, not just in Ireland, but all across Europe and elsewhere. I don't know how many of you saw The Economist magazine just a few weeks ago. It had a table in there that compared education of fathers with education of their sons. And it found that Irish boys whose fathers have a university degree are 70 percentage points more likely to go to university themselves than boys whose fathers did not study at university. In other words, education is a family affair. Well-educated fathers produce well-educated students who go on to get the best jobs. And that's particularly true of Ireland, which was the highest percentage advantage to students whose fathers had gone to universities of any country in Europe. Now, The Economist didn't mention daughters and mums, but they're probably the similar dynamics at work. Now, if participation in universities could be increased, if we could diversify our student body, then anyone who had the brains, the ability, the motivation, and the drive could get the same chance to study at university as those whose fathers got to study at university. You can imagine the difference in society. So let me restate my first takeaway point again. Who gets into university is important to everyone for two reasons. First, a diverse student body presents all students with educational opportunities they would not get any other way. And second, equal access to university is the engine of social mobility. It keeps society refreshing itself generation after generation. And no country in the world can claim to be a truly just society until every single person who has the brains and the motivation, whether they're black or white, disabled or able, old or young, whatever their background, has an equal opportunity to study and live up to their potential and make their ultimate contribution to society. So that's my first point. Now my second point. Despite its many benefits, diversity has proven extremely hard to achieve. Even today, when there are more students enrolled in higher education than at any other time in the history of the world, diversity still remains an unfulfilled goal. Throughout the world, in every country that's ever been studied, the children of the middle and professional classes dominate university enrollments in every single country that's ever been investigated. Working class students, minority group students, low income background students are underrepresented everywhere in higher education. And that social divide between those groups is the greatest at our most selective and prestigious universities. Now, don't get me wrong, higher education has come a long way. We are way more egalitarian now than when I was a child. Most of us sitting in this room today couldn't even imagine a university for whites only or one that excluded Jews or women. But all three of those existed in the USA when I was younger. So we have come quite a way, but we still have quite a way to go. Consider the USA, for example. Thanks to the removal of religious and racial and ethnic quotas in universities, there are far more people from formerly underrepresented groups studying than there are today. Sorry, there are far more today than there were in the past. But these students still tend to come from the middle income families. So while there are more black students, while there are more females, while there are more ethnic minority students, they don't tend to come from working class families or low income families, but from middle and professional minority group families. The low income students still remain a rarity in the elite higher education area of the USA. And when I say a rarity, I mean a really, really rare. In Ivy League universities such as Harvard and Yale, the number of students who come from the lowest quartile of income families is 5%. So in the Harvard, Yale, Brown, Cornell, that group of universities, the percentage of students whose families' incomes would put them in the lowest quartile of the nation is 5%. The number of students in those universities whose family income would put them in the top quartile of income is 66%. So there's a very large divide. Low-income students, if they get to study at higher education at all, are in the less selective recruiting, lower prestige universities, or in the two-year community colleges. The situation in the UK is very similar. Despite spending millions of pounds on trying to encourage widening participation, the graduates of private schools dominate the enrollments of Oxford and Cambridge. By the way, in this talk, when I mean private school, I mean any independent fee charging school, and I'll use the word state school to represent all comprehensive, non-selective, government-funded schools. So getting back to Britain, the data show that social mobility in the country is actually going backwards. British children from disadvantaged backgrounds have actually got less chance of moving up the scale, the social scale now, than they did 30 or 40 years ago. In the 1970s, 2/3 of Oxbridge students came from state schools. Now that figure is only around a half. And that figure is worth emphasizing for the UK particularly because only 7% of UK students actually go to private schools. So 7% of students who go to private schools represent half or more of the students in Oxbridge and in the Russell Group universities. That is a very big difference. Only two universities in the Russell Group have actually met their targets for the enrollments of low-income students. The government set targets, only 2 out of the 20 universities. Social mobility has also slowed here in Ireland. It increased during the boom years of the 1990s, mainly because there were so many jobs around that the influence of education became less. It was possible to move up, at least financially, without education. It's no longer true, and tables have turned now, and education is actually even more important than it ever has been in differentiating who will get ahead. In Australia, the situation is the same. Australian university enrolments have really, really boomed over the last 25 years. There are many more students in university now than there ever were. But Indigenous, Aboriginal students, remote students, rural students, students from low-income backgrounds are still mainly noticeable by their absence in higher education. And like the USA and the UK, in Australia, the students from those groups that do manage to find their way into higher education are mainly found in the less selective institutions or in the technical and further education area. The story is true in most of continental Europe as well. Even good old egalitarian Denmark, which has spent millions trying to encourage access to universities, finds that they have about the same percentage of low-income students now as they had 40 years ago. So it hasn't budged there either. Why is it so hard? Why has it proven so very, very hard to diversify our universities? Well, here's why it's not hard. One of the reasons that we've always thought in the past is low-income students aren't found in universities because they can't afford it. There are some who still fall in that category. They don't come to university because money is just too much of an issue. But even when fees are deferred and payable after you graduate through the tax system, which is what operates in Australia and also in England, or even when higher education is pretty much free, as it is in Denmark and very, very inexpensive here in Ireland, still underrepresented students, low-income students, come from the underrepresented group. And we find about the same percentage of underrepresentation. So it's not just about money. What is it about them? Why are these students not here at university? And the main reason, and I think this is obvious to everyone here and has already been mentioned, the main reason is they tend to lack the qualifications that are required for admission into the selective universities. On the whole, students from wealthier backgrounds, especially those from private secondary schools, actually achieve much higher marks in secondary school than students from low-income backgrounds. And that's not just here in Ireland, but again, everywhere in the world. In England, for example, private school and state grammar graduates are twice as likely to get all A's on their A-levels as students who come from state schools. In the USA, something similar has been found with the SATs, that students from private schools and elite secondary schools score much higher on those entry scores than students from low-income schools. They also study, that is, private school students also tend to study the more difficult subjects. So in England, private school students are twice as likely as state school students to study mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And they're 3 times as likely to do foreign languages. And universities prefer to admit students who have done those subjects. Students who have spent their time on tourism or communications or home economics usually wind up in the less selective universities if they get into university at all. So while having the money to pay fees is not the whole explanation for why low-income students are not being found in universities, money still counts. And that's because money buys the best possible education at the secondary level. The relationship between family income and school performance is very, very high in every OECD country. In the UK, for example, it's actually better, and the Higher Education Policy Institute has actually done this, it's actually easier to predict a student's A-level examination scores, or GCSE examination scores, by knowing how much money that student's father makes than by actually knowing that student's scores in earlier examinations. There's such a high correlation. It's actually a better predictor than school performance itself. Why does money matter so much? Because, as I said, wealthier families can afford to give their children
the best possible education. They can buy homes in neighborhoods with the best schools. Homes near good schools always cost way more than homes near poor schools. They can afford to pay for summer school, for after-school tutoring, and if they absolutely want to, they can opt out of the state system completely and send their children to private schools. The low-income mum, the low-income dad, is stuck with whatever state school happens to be nearby. And the differences among schools are stark. There was a study by UK researchers where 600,000 graduates in a single year, secondary school graduates, were followed right through to university. And as expected, they did find a gap in educational levels achieved by the low-income students and the high-income students. What they didn't realize was the extent of their gap. That this is a massive gap of 2 or 3 times, in some cases even more than that, achievement related to how wealthy your family is. So, yes, students from low-income backgrounds may not actually have the marks to get in, but that's, again, not the only reason they're not going to universities. Low-income students who somehow manage to get the marks that would have gotten them in to selective universities like Trinity College, for example, don't actually apply. They often fail to apply for admissions. And there are several explanations for this. Sometimes they lack the information. They may not actually know that they would have got in had they applied. This is a particular problem in the Australian system of admissions, which is not terribly different from the CAO system. We have ATARs and their rank orders, and students are automatically assigned. But it's particularly a problem in that universities will sometimes make exceptions and offer students with slightly lower ATAR scores, slightly lower entry scores, admission for various reasons. Schools that are in the know this and direct their students towards it. Schools that haven't had much experience, like a lot of the state schools, don't know this and say to their students they wouldn't get in. So some of it is bad information. Some of it is a lack of self-confidence. Some working class students just don't have the confidence that they would actually be able to succeed in a highly charged academic environment such as that provided by a highly selective universities. And there's a third group who are very interesting, who just don't think the culture is for them. Why haven't you applied for a selective university? Well, it's not for me. It's for toffs. And I don't come from that background, and I don't belong there. School teachers tend to reinforce all of these. That is, they reinforce it because they don't have good information either about who will get in, because they themselves don't have confidence that their students will do well, or because they think selective universities are for toffs. And they tend to support and reinforce these negative feelings on part of the students that keep them from applying. Just last month, the Sutton Trust in England did a survey that showed that fewer than half of state school students would recommend that their pupils apply to Oxbridge. Fewer than half. More than half say no, they would never recommend their students to apply to Oxbridge. So it's no wonder they don't apply. And so these reasons, low information, poor self-confidence, very bad advice, actually have quite a large effect on our attempts to diversify. According to the Sutton Trust, just last year alone, there were 3,000 students in England who had the marks for admission into the selective Russell Group's university that didn't actually apply. They called them the missing 3,000 because they never put in an application. And of course, this severely undermines our attempts at university to diversify because we can't admit students who don't actually apply in the first place. So let me just pause for a second and recap where we are. Diversity is vital for education. It's essential to social mobility, but it's very difficult to achieve. One reason is that the students from non-traditional backgrounds tend to lack the entry credentials that selective universities require. Second reason is that even students who do have those credentials don't apply because they don't have good information or for various social reasons. And so this brings me to my third takeaway point. If we want to have a more diverse student body, then we really have to address those 3 important issues. Low aspirations, even students who have the marks don't aspire to go. very poor information about who would get in and who wouldn't get in. And third, of course, the most intractable of all, low entry criteria. Let's start with the low aspirations. How do you get students who do actually have the marks and don't require any special treatment to actually apply to selective universities? And clearly the place to start is with teachers and school principals. The Sutton Trust followed up that survey I mentioned a minute ago by asking the teachers who said they would not encourage their students to go to Oxbridge, why not? Why haven't you? And they found that they just don't have the necessary information. So for example, many of the teachers believed that only 25 to 30% of students at Oxbridge came from state schools. And as I said earlier, the true figure is about half. So they think it's harder than it actually is. They need to know what the actual admission criteria are and how easily or how more difficult they are than they would have been in the previous year, so they can advise students from year to year. How do we do that? Well, we have to have totally transparent criteria. We need to be able to make available to students, guidance counselors, their teachers, their school headmasters and principals precisely how we admit these students and precisely what marks they're required, what prerequisites they require. Now you think that this would be available to all teachers and students, but in fact they often don't know them, whether it's because it's too difficult for them to look them up or because they need somebody to take them by the hand and explain them to them. They often don't know them. So transparent criteria, distinctly clear and easy to understand narrative, perhaps on the website, about how students are admitted, workshops for teachers and for headmasters and for students and potential students and their parents, campus visits, any way that you can do this, any way that you can make it apparent and clear to people how they get in may encourage more students to get in, or at least ensure that they all have the correct information before they make their decision. That 3,000 I mentioned in England may still wind up being 2,000 or 1,000, but at least it won't be because they didn't know they couldn't get in. So I would do that. Ensure that the criteria you use don't disadvantage any eligible candidate from applying for the wrong reasons. When we did our big review in 2004, I was Vice Chancellor in England in those days, we wound up with one college in which being a prefect was considered to be a very good thing, and students would get some marks towards their admission if they had been prefects. When it was explained to the admissions tutor that only private schools had prefects, and that in fact they were discriminating against the other classes, they stopped doing it, but they had no idea they were doing it. So it's very useful to go through your admissions criteria and make sure you're not inadvertently, for the best of motivations, we hope, making mistakes. School teachers and guidance counselors really value feedback on admissions. They like to know why their students didn't get in so that they can give you a hard time, but also so they can give future students better advice. That feedback is an educational mechanism just as it is for our students in class. We need to provide that feedback every year so that guidance counselors understand who to encourage and who not to encourage, and that will, over time, give us allow them to perfect their knowledge and also their advice. Now, none of those things, we should do them, and they will help, but they won't overcome that other feeling that some students have, that higher education is really not for me. It's for people from a different group. It's an alien environment. To change that perception does require outreach programs, and we heard earlier this morning about the outreach programs of this college, TAP, and they've been going for 20 years, and they include every activity from foundation courses to campus visits to school mentoring, and those sorts of things are the only way I can think of that over time will demystify the university for people who have had no experience of the university, who've gone to school where the whole school has had very little experience of university, where their parents have had very little of university. And we need to make that effort. For one thing, it means these are students who have the right marks. So they would get in if they'd only apply. Remember, it's the group that we're trying to motivate already have the marks. They just need the aspirations. And I think that access programs are the best way to do that, particularly those that allow them to spend time on campus, because they could then become used to the sporting facilities, used to the buildings, and used to the way of life, and maybe then think, well, I can manage this. This is not as alien as I thought. I can be good here. In fact, I might even like it. Foundation years, for those who lack the confidence to study in a highly charged academic atmosphere, often are very helpful and make all the difference. People who can come in and have a kind of learn study skills, learn to adapt to the environment, and then transfer on. That's actually quite a good way of doing it. And there's a lot of evidence that they work well. King's College London Medical School offers pupils from state schools a preparatory year for medicine. Now, they've followed these students for many years since they first started doing this. And what they found is that the students who successfully complete the foundation year are indistinguishable from the students who came in with all A's into their second or third year of their medical course. So it really does work, because remember, we're taking students who do have the ability. It's the aspirations and the self-confidence that we're working on. Collecting that outcome data is important, by the way, so we can continue to improve and perfect, see what works, stop what doesn't, of course. Online learning suggests itself now as another possibility. We're seeing a tsunami of activity coming at us from the USA on online learning over the last couple of months. And the most recent being the partnership between MIT and Harvard, but there's also a Princeton, Stanford, and it's all happening very fast. And it occurred to me that online learning may be another way that we can ease people into the university, particularly those from low-income backgrounds or people who have family responsibilities or physical disabilities, to get them started in the online way of learning and then gradually introduce them to the university. Maybe a way for us to bring in non-traditional students that we haven't had before. I think it's been highly underrated in the past. Now, these are all the easy things, by the way, because we're now only been talking about students who actually have the marks to get in to selective universities, but just haven't bothered to apply for various reasons. Let's now look at the harder ones. What about the students who don't have the marks? What about widening participation in elite universities to students that don't actually achieve the Leaving Certificate score? Now, of course, sometimes it's argued that when we talk this way, we're saying universities should make their entry requirements easier, or they should dumb down, as the English say, their courses. That's not what we have in mind. We don't want to dumb down the courses, and we don't want to devalue the currency. And universities do have to have entry criteria. They need to be able to ensure that the students who get into the university are capable of completing their course. It's a waste of their time, a waste of your resources, and it's very demoralizing to bring people in who haven't got the ability to do the course. If they're doomed to fail, they shouldn't be in the course. And it's legitimate for higher education institutions to seek the very best students they can. There's nothing they should be ashamed of in doing that. But, and this is the really, really big but, it's also necessary to ensure that the selection criteria you're using are actually doing what you think they're doing and picking the very best students. It's always confounded, isn't it? We think we have a system, such as the Leaving Certificate system, and that's the best students, and there isn't any other way to do it. What if it turns out that it's not actually choosing the very best students, and there is another way to do it? We're not actually dumbing down the course, we're still choosing the best students, but we're not choosing them in that way. We don't want to misjudge a student's abilities by relying on invalid criteria that don't actually apply to that student. Now, over the years, there have been many accusations that admissions criteria are biased in one way or another. And let me give you a high-profile example. My 2004 inquiry in the UK was motivated, in part at least, by Oxford's rejection of a well-qualified state school student from Newcastle upon Tyne. And her name was Laura Spence. Laura later went on to receive a scholarship to study at Harvard University. Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and a man with ambitions of his own, as many of you will know, said that it was a scandal. That's the word he used, a scandal. An absolute scandal, I think, to be an exact quote. After all, if she was good enough for Harvard, why wouldn't she be good enough for Oxford? Now, the true story is that Laura applied to Oxford to study medicine, and she applied to Harvard as an undergraduate liberal arts student. Not quite the same thing. But why let facts get in the way of a good story, especially when you think they'll embarrass the Prime Minister, whose job you want very badly? So Gordon Brown went on to give an interview in which he said Laura's rejection was based on social class, regional prejudice, rather than her academic suitability for the course. And he said that she had been discriminated against by, quote, an old establishment interview system, unquote. In other words, Brown considered that the interview that Oxford admissions tutors used to choose students for entry into the university was biased against working class applicants, and maybe even particularly working class applicants from Newcastle. Now, Laura may have in fact been intimidated by the ancient buildings, the ancient surroundings, the formidable dons. Maybe it was an intimidating experience for Laura, could very well be. Brown didn't say so, but he seemed to prefer the Harvard approach to admissions, in which a combination of different predictors was used. So marks at school, SAT scores, examination scores, recommendations, personal statement. Harvard does use interviews, but they're not a required part of the admission system, and no student is disadvantaged if they don't have an interview. But those criteria that Harvard used could be just as biased in one way or another against one group of students or another group of students as the interview was biased in Brown's eyes. Let me tell you why. School marks, for example, are they unbiased? Well, no, they can be improved by tutoring. Private tutoring costs money, and therefore perhaps they are biased against people whose parents can't afford extra tutoring. This is true of recommendations and personal statements. If you're a school headmaster who has had a lot of experience with Oxbridge admissions, you know how to write a recommendation. You also know what advice to give the student to write in his or her personal statement. So schools that have considerable experience working with selective universities are going to help their students gain in another form of bias. And this puts students, any student who's going to any selective university, in a situation where their knowledge of the different predictors or their school's knowledge of the different predictors will make a difference. The truth is, everything you can think of to use to choose students is biased in one way or another. They're all subject to social variables, psychological variables, educational variables. There is no such thing as an unbiased predictor to university. And for that reason, admissions decisions are more of an art than a science, and the best approach is not to rely, as Provost said earlier, on a single predictor. The best predictor is to use a variety, a comprehensive set of predictors, so that the deficiencies in one for one group of students may be balanced out by the better nature of others. Now, in Ireland, it turns out, from what I can understand, we don't do that very often. We rely on a rank ordering, which is very similar in Australia as well. But it's not the ideal. The ideal is to use a comprehensive set of predictors in hope of balancing out those weaknesses and strengths. Now, none of this is very controversial, is it? So let's make it controversial, just in case there are any journalists here. Should we also add contextual content into the contextual predictors into the mix? For example, should we want to know what sort of school a student went to, private or public, state school? Now, if you ask the headmasters, certainly in England, they will say, no, don't make that information available. They're afraid that admissions tutors will be biased to one type of school or another, either toward private schools or away from private schools, but biased one way or another. And maybe that's true, and maybe you could leave it out if it were irrelevant. That is, if it didn't really help you choose the students with the best ability and the best motivation. But actually, sometimes the nature of the school that a student or pupil went to is actually quite important and quite predictive. For example, there has been now 3 different studies in 3 different countries to show that a student who did really well but not terrific in a not so good state school is actually a better bet for performance at university than a student who got all A's from a highly cosseted, highly supportive private school. If you didn't know what school that student went to, you would not make the optimum choice. So a student with, say, 2 A's and a B from a very rough and tough state school is probably a better student than one with all A's from a highly supportive private school. If you had no information about the school, you couldn't make that judgment. What other contextual indicators make a difference? Well, family background, whether the mum or dad went to university, work experience, hobbies, all sorts of things. Even family history can be relevant. I mean, this happened during the review. I came across a student who had done exceedingly well in all of her studies, right through school. Just as in her last years, her father died. Family disaster. Her mother had to sell up the house for financial reasons. They had to relocate. She had to change schools. Not surprisingly, her marks weren't as good. They were okay, but they weren't as good as you might have predicted from her previous performance. Is this really irrelevant information? Should you not know this? If you wanted to make a fair judgment, if you were the admissions advisor, wouldn't you want to know that background? Wouldn't that color the way you treated her final year's marks? Well, for most people, the answer would be yes. We would like to know that information, because if we didn't know that information, we might just judge her on her last year's marks and make a mistake and actually reject someone who would have done very well. Those life experiences are not irrelevant. In fact, the obstacles that students have to overcome to achieve the marks that they present for admission in many ways is just as important to us in terms of how it measures motivation and drive and grit and perseverance, just as important as the marks they get themselves. Now, we go too far, and with this I think we probably would all agree, we go too far when we simply give bonus marks to people because they're members of a particular group. So we say all students from state schools or all low-income families or any other group automatically get an advantage in the admissions process. That's not fair either, because after all, not everyone in a private school is advantaged and not everyone in a state school is disadvantaged. Students are individuals. They're each individual, and they should be treated as individuals and assessed that way for admissions. It's also vital to the integrity of any admission system that we keep it consistent. One of the difficulties of devolved admission processes in universities, where many admissions tutors across the university are involved, is trying to get them all on the same page and to act consistently and to actually not find out that we've got one tutor in one part of the university operating differently from the others. Therefore, centralized admissions in universities is much better than devolving it. And since 2004, most of the British universities have moved in that direction. Everyone who's involved clearly needs to be tutored in the principles, the policies that the university uses. And again, training admissions officers and anyone involved in it is quite important. Professionalization of admissions means a more fair system if we can professionalize our admissions processes and our admissions officers. Now, I think probably all of this sounds very expensive and time-consuming and will require a lot of effort and work and expense. And yes, it will, and it is expensive. But it's worthwhile. And let me recap the reasons. A diverse student body is vital to the education of our students. The presence of a group of people in a classroom with different backgrounds and different experiences from different cultures is actually one of the things that we want our students to learn from, to learn inclusivity, to learn acceptance, to learn communication skills, to learn to work with others, to keep their promises, to learn fair play. All of those things are important for the functioning of society and mean that diversity in the classroom is absolutely required. Higher education also is the fairest and most socially acceptable form of social mobility. Getting ahead through higher education is not only fair to everyone in the country, but acceptable to everyone in the country. And if we had a fair admission system, then a person's success in life would not depend on their bank book, it won't depend on who their father is, it will just pretend on their brains and on their motivation. And when it comes to building a fair and just society, who here could ask for more than that? Thank you.
Well, you can see why it was worth going to all the effort to invite Professor Schwartz over. We're delighted to welcome him and his wife Claire. We have a nice lineup with Claire in the afternoon as well, showing her the Book of Kells and the old Parliament building. Trinity actually tried to buy the Parliament building 200 years ago to use as lecture theatres, but the government of the day, British government of the day, prevented us. Afraid the students would get into fights with passerbys. But we still use it occasionally. But we're not going to take questions now because we are going to break for tea and coffee. But Professor Schwartz will engage in the debate in the afternoon, but also in the next session as we talk. So if you have specific questions, he'd be delighted to take them. We have Wi-Fi passes for anyone who wants them. I urge you to fill out your questions and answers form to assist Dr. Bowman in the afternoon. And we'll meet back down here then in 30 minutes.